Okie doke. Now I'm switching to English as well. I'm very happy that Ádám Havas, is that the right way to pronounce your name? Havas?
Havas, exactly.
Havas.
Thank you.
Is here from Budapest. He traveled by train, 14 hours. But he says train travel is nice. He also said he wouldn't do that in Hungary. And he's very proud of Deutsche Bahn. Needs to be said. If you think that working at the Jazz Institute is a really cool job, Ádám works at the really cool institute because his institute is called Milestone Institute, which is called after Miles Davis' famous album.
Exactly.
Really?
No, it's not true, but it can be.
But that's, so he serves as head of social sciences at the Milestone Institute in Budapest. And at the moment, one of Ádám's research focuses is on the cultural construction of jazz in East Central Europe. For our Darmstädter Jazzforum, he originally planned to present a joint paper with Martin Bretanitz, looking both or sharing different perspectives of East European experiences in the DDR, GDR, and in Hungary. However, as Martin couldn't make it, we asked Ádám to enlarge a bit more about the subject of cultural practices of Hungarian Roma musicians and how these become an instrument of reinventing East European difference. Ádám.
Thank you very much, Wolfram. Thank you very much for the invitation. First, I would like to start with two anecdotes. One is a shorter one, the other one is a bit longer, but I believe it all connects to what I'm going to just talk about. So the first, I was witnessing some years ago a conference when they were talking about an edited collection, and the scholars were discussing the geographical breakdown. And it had Asia, the United States, and I just listened to something that it was Europe, then the bracket opens, the parenthesis, and it said, including Eastern Europe. So it made me think that in the kind of cognitive topography of Europe, this is, of course, not a homogeneous entity, but it cannot be described by terms of cultural diversity either, because if you consider this phrase to the analogy of the United States, like imagine something like we have entries covering the United States, including the southern states, then you wouldn't think of diversity, you would think of difference, and you would think of race and place-based inequalities that kind of structure our thoughts and aesthetic judgments on jazz. So to wrap it up, my talk will be, and my work is about that, it's about East European difference, this quasi-Europeanness and the unwhiteness of East Europeans, which cannot be understood according to the same categories as central countries. And I think that's what makes jazz a very interesting topic, the music of the West, the music of African Americans, in a place which is in between East and the West, sort of within the twilight zone. And this gives it an aesthetic and epistemological potential that my work explores. My second example is more related to jazz, and I would like to just ask if any one of you recognize the gentleman with the violin. Mm-hmm.
No? Eddie South?
Yes, Eddie South, thank you. Great. I don't ask him, but that these three gentlemen will be connected into what I refer to as a diasporic narrative. And this would be my second anecdote that kind of gives the flesh and blood of my talk, because I wanted to start with theoretical underpinnings of cultural sociology and post-colonial thought, but that would be too alienating for the morning. So I decided to start with something that makes us arrive to the same conclusions without theoretical jargon. So, as you might know, Eddie South was an African-American violinist who actually studied in the Chicago Conservatory of Music, but because of racial segregation, he couldn't continue as a as a classical musician what he performed originally. So he went to Paris first, and there they studied popular music, and it's also related to this big migration flow in the 20s of African Americans to Paris, which has a lot of literature. I think you are aware of that. And what makes it even more interesting, at least to me, that South traveled in the late 20s to Hungary, Budapest, where he was the student of the internationally renowned violinist, a classical violinist, Jenő Hubai, who left his position in the Belgium Academy. He was leading the department of violin and left it to become the director of the Franz Liszt University, or the Hungarian Academy of Music, that is today is the most prestigious institution in Hungary. And what is interesting that South was learning. The fact is very interesting that this, heavy-headed Hungarian classical violinist at the top of the institutional hierarchies in music in Hungary actually had South as a private student. Secondly, South was learning gypsy melodies and csárdas from Hubai. That influenced him to the extent that he even used one of Hubai's compositions as a signature tune, namely Helyre Kati. It's very much, it's like you will see the harmonic relationships between bebop and csárdas, and there is a huge structural similarity in that was explored by South. And then he went back to France because he was traveling all around, and in South France, before Django would meet Stefan Grappelli, he knew this violin used in a jazz context based on gypsy motifs. This was a major influence on Django Reinhardt. So why I said this? Because as the slide shows, I'm interested in diasporic genealogies, which means that I do not accept for empirical reasons this teleological north to west to the east dissemination narrative of jazz, that it was imported passively by the host countries. But I'm, along Bruce Johnson, who wrote a book now called Jazz Diaspora, I'm talking about diasporic reinventions of the music. So I'm interested in the agency of people from different background and nationality and racial background to invent new music that cannot be understood along typical narrative frameworks of this kind of these canonic discussions. So I just started with this because these people are coming from so different backgrounds, and it still kind of fuses it into jazz. Not to mention that Paris was kind of showed a different narrative of modernization in Western Europe, and Hungary, for its post-monarchic position, represented a very different path within Europe, a sort of semi-peripheral modernization path. And I think South was kind of merging these ideas and in these cultural embeddedness, and jazz was actually a material that made it possible. Even the use of violin would, I think, require a whole presentation. So here's the theoretical jargon. I have to tell that when I started to write my book, that will be soon out, I hope, I started as a relatively orthodox Bourdieusian. I'm a sociologist, and I was interested in the development of local fields. So I used this very, very complicated Bourdieusian conceptual apparatus to grasp how the jazz field in Hungary began to institutionalize and represent different positions, fighting for monopolizing the aesthetic value within that national scene. But as I was researching the Hungarian archives, I realized that it is my material, namely jazz, that is essentially transnational and global, so I cannot use only a theoretical framework that allows me to interpret nation-state level distinctions. So I found Paul Gilroy, amongst many others, and this has become kind of the major question to my work, namely, how are we to think critically about artistic products and aesthetic codes, which, though they may be traced back to one distinct location, have been changed either by the passage of time or by their displacement, relocation, or dissemination through networks of communication and cultural exchange. So this is from the Black Atlantic. No, this is from a journal article preceding the Black Atlantic, but I'm sure it can be found, maybe phrased differently in the Black Atlantic as well. So that is the question that I was interested in, and this is why East Europe and my topic presented itself as not an add-on to canonic big narratives of jazz, but is a sort of critical viewpoint on the global trajectory of jazz. So it is, I think, a very interesting or important position and epistemological position to emphasize that I'm talking about this East European difference that is a critique to or a counterculture to modernity in a way. Remember that Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, the subtitle is the counterculture to modernity, and I think these diasporic cultural forms can be and shall be understood as sort of countercultures to dominant frameworks in politics and art. So what I endeavor to do in this talk is nearly impossible. Namely, I'm going to show how the genealogy of jazz in Hungary unfolded musically in the short 20th century. I said impossible because I can only show you some mosaics of what I mean by these diasporic reinventions of jazz in Hungary. So starting by the interwar era, I gave this a title, which is from my book, This Othering Effect of Jazz. And what I would like to emphasize here, that when jazz and jazz musicians arrived in the 20s to Hungary, the popular music entertainment was dominated overwhelmingly by gypsy musicians. I'm using gypsy musicians because this is the term to define gypsy music. Romani music would be different, just a terminological note aside that I'm using these terms consciously. So gypsy musicians felt that black music, or as they called it, Negro music, was a threat to them, a threat to their existence, but that was just an economic crisis. They soon started strategically frame the difference or distinction between jazz and Hungarian song, csárdas, whatever, this urban popular song that they were played, even though it wasn't mostly composed by them, but they were the performers, as a cultural struggle, as a Kulturkampf, meaning that they were represented themselves, I mean Romani musicians, they were representing themselves as the defenders of national culture coded as white. It's a very interesting dynamics because we are talking about the significant oppressed other in Hungary who are still very much oppressed because of racism and exclusion and segregation and so on. But it was this era that jazz kind of subverted the racial hierarchies and the racialized notion of what counted as national culture. So with the emergence of jazz in Hungary, gypsy musicians, as I say it with post-colonial lingo, it sort of whitened out. They never were so white as in the interwar era because they were the main representatives of national popular music between the two wars. And similarly, assimilated Hungarian Jews, and just give you an idea, at the turn of the century, 40% of the Franz Liszt Academy or the Music Academy students were Jews. Even when I was doing the research, I just wasn't realized that data struck me that was that the assimilated Jewry was so dominant in certain cultural, intellectual, and artistic sectors. It's really fascinating, and it's very interesting because the venues, the cabarets, the Hungarian Broadway bars were dominated. I mean, they run mostly by assimilated Hungarian Jews who were importing modern and Western and new and trendy music for the newly emerging urban audiences who really liked it. So gypsy musicians really felt this economic pressure that there is a shift from traditional forms of popular entertainment towards Western or international forms that actually, in many cases, satirizes the old-fashioned traditional forms of art. So in these distinctions, the major players are gypsy musicians, Hungarian assimilated Jews, and Black American jazz musicians. So these are the kind of racialized universe of music that is absolutely and radically reorganizes when jazz appears in Hungary, that Jews become black. I'm using this as metaphors, but I think you understand based on what I said. And the gypsies are kind of whitening out, and the ultimate threat on national culture, which has to be, pure, which has to be representing the traditional Christian Hungarian values, whatever they meant by it. But that was the logic of the discussions that I was analyzing. So these are these quotes from are representative. I could have shown hundreds and hundreds of that. But this was the dominant discussion. It seems that the gypsies are hurt more by the devastation of Hungarian dance and Hungarian song than Hungarians. I mean, those who visit these jazz concerts, who like marionettes are under the control of the dominating Negro spirit in the sphere of press, fashion, literature, art, music, dance. The gypsy musician either emigrates or he is forced to adapt to a new fashion and play exotic dance music, which is with his old violin. This is a deep crisis which fundamentally undermines the Hungarian people's traditional music and its traditional guardian, the Hungarian gypsy. It's amazing from this perspective of Hungarian anti-gypsyism and the rise of radical right parties. It is just from zoom out a little bit and see the historical perspective that it's amazing that Hungarian gypsies were actually presented by the national conservative press as the defendant of the national culture. And this is why music and jazz as an agency, that it does change and subvert racialized cultural and social hierarchies. So they go as far as, if things continue like this, gypsies will die out, emphasis mine, and with them the Hungarian song will start to decay too. Sorry, that's a typo. But so this was the general understanding, and I read multiple articles of that. While at the same time there was a high art criticism of jazz, and the first Hungarian jazz book, just 2 years after the first special issues in Anbruch and the other journal, Jazz appeared, a musicologist, Molnár, wrote in 1928 a book called Jazz Band. And this shows a different criticism than the popular understanding of jazz. In Molnár's Jazz Band, he kind of compares jazz to pest, syphilis. He talks about the most degrading terms about the music, but not on the basis as the popular discussion on jazz and gypsies, but because, according to him, jazz was mainly threatening the position of Hungary within the Western teleological canonic tradition that was accepted by him as a universal value. So while it was more like a national positioning, these discursive constructions of jazz and race and blackness and whiteness and Jewness and gypsiness, etc., in the high art discussion, the first serious criticism of jazz was about jazz is threatening classical music. And look at Stravinsky and Milhaud and Satie and all the others that started to draw on jazz, especially rhythmic-wise. It was perceived as a threat from Molnár, but the main stake here was Hungary's positioning as a West European country. So that's kind of the geopolitical logic behind the despisal or the criticism of jazz. I don't have much time, but I realized, and I think it's pretty under-discussed, that the first post-secondary education in jazz was established by in Frankfurt, Hochschule, by a Hungarian assimilated Jew called Mátyás Seiber, as you probably know it better than me. It could be a diasporic narrative or anecdote, as he met he first encountered jazz in an ocean liner as a session musician, as a cellist, as a matter of fact. And then unlike instead of going back to Hungary, where he was a student of Zoltán Kodály, he decided to go to Germany and start to be the propagator of jazz, and he has significant advances. Even he wrote textbooks, and I think he did a lot for the dissemination of jazz in Weimar, Germany. You can think of the works of Wippingler or Thomson, Hans Christian Thomson, who wrote on jazz in Weimar, Germany. But it's I think it's a very interesting kind of a diasporic side of the European dissemination of that who disseminated jazz and why, in what cultural context. Yeah, so I'm arriving very quickly to the second phase, and we were discussing this Iron Curtain, and I will tell why I prefer to use the term implemented by Péteri called the nylon curtain. That in many cases the Iron Curtain, or what is called the Iron Curtain, was acoustically transparent. So if you just look at the diversity of East European scenes, so you can just think of Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, that would have been the topic of Martin Bretternitz. We can see an extreme level of diversity when there is no master narrative to grasp how Polish jazz became what it became, from Krzysztof Komeda's famous Astigmatic album, and in Hungary why this kind of Bartók-oriented free jazz music became prominent. But what I want to emphasize is that my sociological study showed that unlike West America, unlike North American interpretations of jazz in the Cold War era, where jazz was understood as a cultural weapon, think of the works of Penny von Eschen, for example. Jazz was, in Hungary at least, it wasn't a Trojan horse of liberal democracy. So that was a huge ban on jazz, like in any other countries in the region, from 48, when the communists got into power. But after the 56 revolution in Hungary, across the Eastern Bloc, there were political measures that shifted from ban to tolerance. And there were different strategies of cultural policymakers, what to do with jazz, how to tame jazz, how to nationalize jazz. And there were really highly different strategies. So in Hungary, this new generation of jazz musicians appearing in the 60s, they deliberately wanted to position themselves as high modernist, high art musician. They didn't conceive jazz as a vehicle for social change or counterculture. Rather, they wanted to have the same status as classical music. And I think this is the sort of bittersweet tragedy of the bebop paradigm that institutionalized in 65 in the Bartók Conservatory, which was the first such institution in the Eastern Bloc. And this is a huge achievement. I'm not underplaying the achievement that in Hungary in the 65 you had a jazz department. I mean, it's fantastic. But every curriculum has a latent curriculum. It is not something taken for granted. And this Budapest-centered scene started to be sort of engaged with this mainstream post-swing era of jazz, which has serious consequences. And again, if you look at gypsy musicians, there is a very important tendency that I try to explore, namely that gypsy musicians playing gypsy music, already they are coming from professional musician families. There is a huge influx from traditional gypsy music to jazz. That's a very, very interesting social phenomenon. And I don't have like 100% for sure answers, but I made more than 40 hours of transcribed interviews with musicians, and including a lot of Romani musicians. And it is very important for them that the high art turn of jazz allowed them to have a sort of social status, but at the same time they could become not the dominated ones in the scene, but became the idols, became the virtuoso sort of aristocracy of the mainstream bebop scene, and that's actually not as surprising as it may look for the sociologist for the first time, because of the structural similarities between Csárdas and gypsy music and jazz. So there is a lot of emphasis on improvisation. There is a lot of emphasis on parlando rubato technique. There is a lot of emphasis on virtuosity. There is even this similarity that Hungarian songs were composed by gypsy music, what is called gypsy music, is usually composed by non-Romani authors. And there is a similarity of like jazz standards, that you have this composition and then you improvise and then you reinvent this musical structure ad infinitum, sometimes ad nauseam. But that's the kind of, there are many similarities that the habitus, the sort of musical attitude, I prefer habitus for different reasons, facilitated this transition from gypsy music to jazz. And I think this is a very significant aspect of the Hungarian jazz scene. But again, I don't think it's the right word would be diversity. Again, if you look at the Hungarian jazz scene today, you would see that there are many, many Romani musicians, and this is the kind of curiosity of Hungarian scene. But so it would be pro forma diverse, but Hungary is not. So it's not that easy. I mean, there is a lot of racism and anti-Gypsyism in Hungary, and you cannot deduce from like of a statistical distribution of people of certain ethnicity, race, and gender. It doesn't mean in many cases equality, but it does mean that there is agency to these musicians. So they as I said, the symbolic hierarchy is turned upside down, and they could have the capacity of really do things that we would assume majority society people assume to majority society. So if we consider that minorities have agencies and to decide on their actions and etc., then they indeed did make this selection process. They did implement the logic of inclusion, exclusion, and boundary making, and whom they accept. It is. I heard many stories that jazz musicians were in jam session on bebop playing Romani musicians, and they were like scared, and they referred to the Budapest Jazz Club as the lion's cage, because there you get kind of symbolically executed if you cannot follow the patterns dictated. And so it's a very interesting thing, Romani's role, because it's at the same time social mobility, and at the same time it allows them to improvise their difference. So it's not about assimilation per se. It's about improvising their difference based on ethnicity and their cultural traditions, and I think it's an important, it's a distinction that cannot be underplayed. And I'm closing the presentations with a little bit of reflection on the topic mentioned by Philip, because in the late 70s, the scene in Hungary began to polarize between Budapest, that was it's a simplification, but we can say that it was dominated by musicians mainly into the mainstream jazz scene, and it was officially supported. And the avant-garde scene was, first of all, it didn't exist until the 70s. It was György Szabados, the founding father of Hungarian free jazz, who abandoned mainstream jazz influences and started to create a free improvised avant-garde music that was heavily built on local folk music traditions, jazz, blues, and most of all, Bartokian ideas of music. That's very important, because jazz musicians didn't consider Szabados as a jazz musician, and avant-garde musicians who were actually, they were fond of the Neue Musik centered in Darmstadt. They didn't accept Szabados either, because for them he was a dilettante. So that's the kind of the consecrated avant-garde or contemporary classical music. So he kind of got into a aesthetic and musical wasteland in between jazz and the consecrated avant-garde music, which is a cultural vacuum. And that situation sort of changed with the establishment of Győr is a small northwestern town in Hungary, where there was like this bottom-up avant-garde music initiatives, so very similarly to what was happening in Nikolsdorf. Actually, I just read through the program sheet that Philip circulated, and 70% of the program and the musicians were really the same, and it gives me the idea that the supports more the nylon curtain idea, and at the same time it does support that this free avant-garde or emancipated, but that's a very, very tricky term, scene, that was a scene made up by loosely connected or very well connected, in fact, local scenes, which are situated in the periphery. So in Budapest it would have been much more harder because of the state control and state censorship to establish a center for avant-garde jazz movement. So it was in Győr, which was under the radar from many extent, and that became the underground center for free jazz. And it's also not the music which is interesting per se. You can think of the 74 album of George Szabados. It's called The Wedding. I really recommend you to have a look at that, because that's a very matured piece of what this Hungarian free jazz would stand for. But it was a counterculture to modernity, a counterculture to capitalist modernity, and the counterculture of state socialism and communism. So that there is a double negation that characterized its music, and I got to the point when I never really had the chance to discuss this, but I think this is very much important when we make sense of music and free music and try to use concepts such as diversity or identity or openness, as a matter of fact, that according to Szabados, Black American music, including jazz, was folk music. It wasn't a socialist interpretation. It was according to him, if we take every folk music, wherever we are in the world, east and west, south and north, if you take every music and be folk music that emanates from people's communities, we will find what he referred to as a antique musical ocean that is built on the same logic or structures. This is a very Bartokian idea. So it is very, I think, misleading to interpret Hungarian free jazz, or like this Hungarian, like you add this national denominator. It's not Hungarian in a sense that it wants to be particularist. It says that you have to explore your own folk music in order to join to this transnational and global discussion of music. So when he was having a jam session with Anthony Braxton in '82, which was a huge thing in Győr, that Braxton, who was the top in the Downbeat magazine, didn't go to Budapest where all the institutional centers are, but when he went to Győr, this jam session between Szabados and Braxton is really could be best understood with the terms of perhaps with George Lewis, who talks about Eurological and Afrological perspectives in music, because they were representing different approaches, but somehow it merged, and it became sort of a universal language of free improvisation, and that's, I think, the most important element, not the national particularism, and you can get to that idea from many directions, and I think it's very important to emphasize that the folk and black origins of jazz, does not contradict concentrating on national folk music, but in this view, this is very much the same. Yeah, I close it up. Thank you. I'm actually in time. So I think this has some serious consequences on how jazz stories and jazz studies or popular music studies is reconsidering its epistemological foundations when they approach certain topics. So these are my answers to how the shape of jazz studies to come should look like in the future. Instead of unilinear hagiographic narratives, I think there should be more emphasis on historical sociological research, cultural history, on diasporic reinventions. the diversification of the canon. Yeah, my problem with the diversification of the canon is that it follows a canonic logic. So you can diverse up the canon. You can always find a, I don't know, mixed background musician who was great, and you can add that and canonize, but it still follows a canonization logic. And I think there's more important maybe talking about meaning constructions and how jazz becomes a vehicle for communicating, meanings from an everyday perspective. So I'm not into canon. It's an important reference point, but I'm more of challenging the canon in my works. So the blackness and whiteness as monolithic concepts, so this I think has to absolutely challenged. If you look at just the works of Amiri Baraka and others, it is absolutely becomes true that there are many multiple identity positions within what is referred to as black, and I think it's very misleading to talk just black in general. We have to be context sensitive always regarding these identities. That's why Paul Guerra is a major reference to me. So I think it's the geopolitical embeddedness of racialized discourses that should be centered. So West centrism, Eurocentrism, I propose a post-colonial and global perspective, and this is why West centrism, I think that the huge emphasis on identity politics and diversity, I think this is part of this patronizing West centrism. So if I had to define what is the West centrism or Europe centrism of jazz studies, for example, then I would say it is the under definition of concepts such as openness and diversity. Because for me, these are, as a sociologist, I need to work with empiric, operational definitions of this context so that I can do research and really tell based on where and what selection processes racism, sexism, and all these things work out. Sometimes I don't feel that it has a very depth to just terms of diversity, as I tried to show with the overrepresentation of Romani musicians in Hungary, and that would be pro forma diverse, but it is not really the case. Yeah, and I think East European sociologists and people from scholars and others from the global south, that is from, say, the not from the West, they shouldn't self-orientalize themselves. I heard many jazz conferences when the East European scholars are telling their stuff as an orientalistic curiosity into the Western audiences, that we have this, and that's how interesting it is. No, I don't want this. I don't want to orientalize myself. I think that this should be understood as a critical discourse that is a fundamental part of what is known to be jazz and the global cultural development of jazz. So I think we should be a bit more conscious in our approach, and that means self-confidence as well. So I think the periphery and the semi-periphery has huge critical potentials to challenge the canonic narratives dominated by mostly Anglo-American scholars. So thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Ádám. Now you gave us some homework to do, which I really like. Can you put on the last slide?
Yes.
So those are going to be the next Jazzforum conferences, one by the other. But yes, that is actually, those are things that we need to talk about. Anybody to ask the first question, except for me? Yeah.
Thank you very okay. Thank you very much, Ádám, thank you very much, Ádám, for your very illuminating presentation. I was interested in your utilization of the terms Eurologic and Afrologic, and you were talking about a saxophonist who was important for the emergence of Hungarian free jazz. Unfortunately, I can't remember his name, but you mentioned one particular performance with Anthony Braxton, and you spoke about this Hungarian saxophonist representing a Eurologic perspective and Braxton representing an Afrologic perspective, and you talked about merging of these two concepts. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. When I said these tricky terms that some people may not be familiar with it, I decided to stop, but really thank you very much, Harald, for bringing this up. My understanding of, so Szabados was I don't know, piano player, and Braxton, of course, was a saxophonist. And my basic reference for Braxton was Radano's book, this Braxton's cultural critique of Braxton, and then the emancipation literature, and a lot of George Louis on the topic, and your book as well. So it was what I discussed even with free jazz musicians in Hungary who are active now, and they are very, very influenced by Szabados's musical legacy. So everything what is free jazz kind of grew out from the quote of Szabados, is that Braxton can be categorized as an Afrological musician who is representing an Afrological perspective in music, but who was very much into this Eurological approach to music. And Szabados in hand was very Eurological in that sense, who was found by Afrological music. So I think I didn't say this, but this is the key to understand that it's not just the two ideal types are playing together, but they had very strong knowledge of each other's background and interest, and this is why it made this jam session according to the critics. And then they would play again and again. Braxton and Szabados, they even have an album which you can find in YouTube, because this kind of difference that they didn't want to underplay the difference that I'm coming from a black avant-garde circle, and I'm very open to European music, and I'm a Christian middle-class Hungarian who has learned music from Bartók, but then jazz changed my life because of its freedom, because of blues, because of the very important role blues and jazz played in the emancipation, the social emancipation of black people in the States. So I think this tension is the key to understand how these Eurological and Afrological categories work, because they were not pure as categories. And I think this jam session was interesting because of this very common understanding of the differences, but also on the language of free improvisation that worked out. And that is the magic, that you don't have pre-organized session, pre-rehearsals, you don't have a musical sheet. They just started to really react on each other's musical themes that ended up really well. And I think that's the stake of free jazz, that doesn't have a fully fledged aesthetics. So I would say like something like that. Thank you very much for the question.
I have a question that may be besides the point, but I ask it anyhow. So you talk about Romani musicians, and I'm aware of the fact that Romani culture in Hungary is a very specific culture, and yet I thought about Roma musicians elsewhere in Europe. Did you, I mean, could some of the findings, some of the discussion, or some of the things that you said about Romani musicians in Hungary and their social status and how they identified with jazz for specific reasons, could that also be transferred to Roma musicians elsewhere in Europe, or?
I get your question, and I think that's the topic of another book. No, because I'm talking about the social genealogy of a sort of musical habitus that is built upon musical tradition, the fact that they learn music in the circumstances of a very early childhood. So I have multiple really illuminating interviews when the Romani guy says to me is that, Ádám, I'm just going to this Liszt conservatory to have these papers. I already know this stuff when I was 13th. And he's not really exaggerating in a sense, because they are really learning music as a, the music functions as language in middle class families, really. So that's why sometimes they don't have a very sophisticated conceptual apparatus, but they have a very sophisticated musical apparatus, because in family gatherings, the music is the integrative force. And to answer your question, absolutely, and I think stylistic diversity shouldn't deceive us. I just tell you an anecdote. Again, I went to Malaga, and I was seeing there people jamming flamenco music, Spanish, Andalusian, gypsy people jamming flamenco, and I just asked about them that, how did you learn that? So just in a causal talk. And they said exactly the same stuff as I heard from Hungarian Romani jazz musicians. Exactly, that this is in our blood. That means that actually we learned it from childhood, but you have to do this stuff. So what is the rhetoric and discursive codes of what I refer to as musical socialization? They, of course, don't use the term musical socialization. It's my interpretation. But they kind of constructed a narrative based on the very same categories that I encountered in Hungary. And I think there is the importance of this future book would be that the habitus, or let's say attitude, is constant, is permanent, despite the changes. This is Amiri Baraka's concept, the changing same. I think that's very applicable to Romani people.
Thank you so much, Ádám, for your presentation. I wanted to ask about Eddie South. So it reminded me a little bit of also Will Marion Cook's education, going to Europe, studying with maybe Josef Joachim. We still don't know exactly if it was one of his someone subbing for Joachim. But what interests me is, if we think about the economical perspective, that you have to be really well versed in different styles. You have to be able to, make a living with that music and different musics. It interests me, like, first when he was in Chicago, you said, maybe I mistook it, but you said he didn't have the opportunity to study at the conservatory. I think that is not correct, because he was, like many African Americans could. By the way, Chicago Musical College and there's a Chicago College of Music. There are two different ones. Did you mean that, or was it more that you said he didn't have the opportunities in the market then to get gigs in the classical world? And then how far? That's the second question. How far also gypsy musicians and as you said, the Hungarian Jews, that they transcended these borders and played the other music. You know what I mean? Just for economic reasons. Those are two questions, but maybe you could elaborate on them.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. You are absolutely right. I just read what I found, the very scarce material of Eddie South. Everything that I read said that because of racial segregation, he left the United States, and maybe he started studying at the college, but he didn't continue their study, and originally he prepared to become a classical violinist. So this is what I knew from the very scarce resources, and I fully accept that you are right in putting this into right detail. My major point that was he was aspiring to become a classical violinist, and because of racial segregation, he kind of could not pursue that career, and that was a major motivation for him to leave the United States. So yes, but you're right. I mean, I really would like to go deeper into that, so I fully accept that. Thank you very much. And your second question, yes, I mean, the whole idea with jazz a little bit is that these professional musicians and gypsy musicians, this cultural hybridity of their repertoire wasn't motivated by very much by inner factors, but by the fact that the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was a very multi-ethnic, multicultural place, and they had to place all kind of popular musics in order to satisfy the audience, because that was their profession. And if you go to a Hungarian restaurant, say a German tune, say autumn leaves, which they don't know as autumn leaves, but they have their Hungarian words for that, even though that the composer of the tune is Hungarian expat in Paris. So they really have to play like that, and that was their living. So this cultural hybridity is motivated by economic factors. So this otherness, so this other music played by the others. I would translate it to your questions. The other music played by the others. I think that's how we should understand cultural globalization. That internal others try to play the music of others, but at certain point it wasn't just hybridity and eclecticism to please the audiences for purely service sectoral reasons or economic reasons, but it kind of become incorporated into their musical habitus. And this is why I talk about genealogy, because then with the new generation of Romani musicians growing up in the 60s then this is many people, they tell me that I don't like to play and I can't play Hungarian song, Csárdas. They identify with Black Americans, and then when they say that you phrase jazz like you are a gypsy, like would really, oh, how diverse is that, how exotic is that, they hate that. Really, this is when they are being compared to their heritage, and this is very tricky, they totally deny that with the right, because they are doing proper bebop and the jazz tradition, and that became autonomous. Yes, the main question is that for me, and this was the main social critique of cultural critique of Szabados, that they are falling to the trap of epigonism. And they weren't, not just Romanis, just the jazz scene in general in Hungary, they didn't draw on their own cultural depths to produce something original. And this is also because the capital neoliberal cultural industry, that what can be sold from the Balkans and from East Europe, is an orientalized, tamed version prepared for this market dominated by the West. So this is why even many Romani musicians create Romani jazz fusions. I'm very skeptical with that, because I can hear that it's sold as very authentic, but it is prepared, made for this international market. So that's, I think, a very interesting topic. Thank you very much.
We have to break up here. Thank you very much, Ádám.
Thank you, Wolfram.
Thanks so much for being here. And
thank you.
Times, which is because we started late, I would say we continue in 10 minutes with Niklaus Troxler talking about Willisau and his life.